You think being broke just means having less money, but that's not what it really feels like. Because when you're broke, everything costs more, not just financially, but mentally, emotionally. And over time, it starts to affect the way you make decisions, the way you think, the way you live. And the worst part is, most people don't even realize it's happening. They just feel stuck, like no matter how hard they try, they can't get ahead. And it doesn't make sense at first. Because you're doing what you're supposed to do. You're working. You're trying to be responsible. You're not wasting money on stupid things. And yet, it still feels like you're falling behind. Like every small setback hits harder than it should. Like every mistake costs more than it should. And slowly, without even noticing it, you start playing the game differently. Not to win, but just to survive. And the hardest part about being broke isn't just that you don't have enough money. It's that every decision starts to cost more than it should. Not because the price changed, but because your situation did. When you have money, you can think long-term. You can plan. You can wait. But when you don't, everything becomes urgent. You can't wait for a better deal. You can't buy in bulk. You can't invest in something that saves you money later. You're forced to choose what solves the problem right now, even if it costs you more in the long run. And that's where the cycle begins. Because every short-term decision quietly makes your future more expensive. You buy cheaper things that break faster. You pay more in fees because you don't have a buffer. You get stuck with higher interest because you don't have better options. And none of it feels like a bad decision in the moment. It feels necessary. It feels like survival. But over time, those small decisions stack up. They compound. Not in your favor, but against you. Until one day, you look at your situation and wonder why everything feels so heavy, why nothing seems to improve, and why it feels like you're working harder just to stay in the same place. Because being broke doesn't just limit what you can buy. It limits what you can choose. And when your choices are limited, your outcomes are limited too. You don't get the cheaper options. You don't get the better opportunities. You don't get the flexibility that makes life easier. Instead, you get what's left. What's available. What you can afford right now. And that gap between what's optimal and what's possible is where most people get stuck. Because from the outside, it looks like bad money management. It looks like poor decisions. It looks like a lack of discipline. But from the inside, it feels completely different. It feels like you're doing your best in a situation that keeps making things harder. And the more pressure you feel, the harder it becomes to make good decisions. Because now you're not just thinking about money. You're thinking about stress, about risk, about what could go wrong. And suddenly, even small decisions feel overwhelming. Even simple choices feel heavy. And that's when it really starts to affect you. Not just your finances, but your mindset. Because when every decision feels like it matters this much, you stop thinking about growth. You stop thinking about progress. And you start thinking about one thing only. How do I get through this without falling further behind? But what if being broke isn't just something that happens to you? What if it's something that quietly shapes every decision you make, without you even realizing it? Because when you don't have money, you don't just lose options. You lose timing. You lose leverage. You lose the ability to choose what's best. And instead, you're forced to choose what's available. And that changes everything. Because now, you're not making decisions based on what's smart. You're making decisions based on what's possible. And those are not the same thing. Think about it. The person with money can wait. They can compare. They can choose quality over urgency. But when you're broke, waiting becomes a luxury. Planning becomes a risk. And thinking long-term feels almost irresponsible. Because what matters isn't what saves you money later. It's what keeps you going right now. So you adapt. You start solving problems the fastest way you can. Not the smartest way. Not the cheapest way. Just the way that works in the moment. And over time, that becomes your default. Not because you're bad with money, but because your environment trained you that way. Because every time you tried to think ahead, something urgent pulled you back. Every time you tried to save, something unexpected took it away. Every time you tried to get ahead, you were reminded how far behind you really were. And eventually, you stopped trying to optimize. You stopped trying to improve. You just try to stabilize, to survive, to keep things from getting worse. And that's when being broke stops being a temporary situation and starts becoming a pattern of decisions, a pattern of trade-offs, a pattern of constantly choosing between two bad options and picking the one that hurts a little less. And from the outside, it's easy to judge that. It's easy to say, why didn't you just make a better choice? But that question assumes something that isn't always true. It assumes that better choices were actually available. Because when your resources are limited, your choices are limited too. And when your choices are limited, your outcomes start to look predictable. Not because you didn't try, but because the system you're in keeps narrowing your options over time. And the more that happens, the more it feels like you're stuck in a loop you can't break. Not because you're not capable, but because every path forward seems to come with a cost you can't afford to take. Here's what's actually happening. When you don't have enough money, you lose access to efficiency. You lose access to better options. And you lose access to time. Because having money isn't just about what you can buy. It's about what you can avoid. Late fees, high interest, emergency costs, all the things that quietly make life more expensive, only show up when you don't have a cushion. When you don't have savings, a small problem doesn't stay small. It becomes urgent. And urgency is expensive, because now you don't have the luxury to compare prices. You don't have time to wait for something better. You take what's available, even if it costs more, even if it's not ideal. And that happens again, and again, and again, until over time, you end up paying more for the same things, or sometimes even worse things. That's why people with less money often end up paying more overall, not because they want to, but because they don't have the options that would save them money. And it doesn't stop there, because once you start falling behind, it gets harder to catch up. Interest builds, fees stack, opportunities disappear, and slowly, your financial situation becomes less flexible, more fragile, more sensitive to change. So even small disruptions start to feel like major setbacks. A broken phone, a car repair, a medical bill, things that should be manageable suddenly feel overwhelming because there's no margin for error, no buffer, no room to absorb the impact. And that's what creates the pressure. Not just the lack of money, but the lack of space. Space to think, space to plan, space to make better decisions. Because good financial decisions almost always require one thing: time. And when you're constantly under pressure, time is the one thing you don't have. So instead of making decisions that move you forward, you make decisions that keep you afloat. And over time, that difference becomes everything. Because while others are optimizing, you're stabilizing. While others are building, you're maintaining. And that gap keeps getting wider. And after a while, you stop thinking about getting ahead. Not because you don't want to, but because it stops feeling realistic. You start focusing on stability, on keeping things together, on making sure nothing falls apart. And that becomes your goal, not growth, not progress, just survival. And the longer you stay in that state, the more it changes the way you see everything. Opportunities don't feel exciting anymore. They feel risky. Decisions don't feel empowering. They feel stressful. Even small improvements start to feel uncertain, because when you've spent so much time trying not to lose, it's hard to switch back to trying to win. And that shift happens quietly, without you noticing, until one day you realize you've been playing defense this whole time, protecting what little you have instead of building something more. And that's a hard realization, because it doesn't come with a clear solution. It doesn't tell you exactly what to fix. It just shows you why everything feels harder than it should, why progress feels slow, why even your best effort doesn't seem to create the results you expected. And maybe that's where most people get stuck. Not because they're lazy, not because they don't care, but because they've been operating in a system that constantly prioritizes urgency over opportunity, pressure over planning, short-term survival over long-term growth. And when you live in that environment long enough, it becomes your normal, your default, your way of thinking. So when things don't improve, you don't question the structure. You question yourself. You assume you're the problem, that you're not disciplined enough, not smart enough, not doing enough. And that belief keeps you trapped, because if you think the problem is you, you'll keep trying harder in the same conditions. You'll push yourself more, sacrifice more, stress more, without ever stepping back to ask, is this even designed to work for me? Because if every system around you is built to take first and leave you with what's left, then of course it feels like you're always behind. Of course it feels like you're always catching up. Not because you're failing, but because you're starting from a place where progress is harder by default. And maybe the real shift isn't just about working harder, or budgeting better, or cutting more expenses. Maybe it starts with understanding what you're actually dealing with, understanding the pressure, understanding the limitations, understanding why things feel the way they do. Because once you see that clearly, something changes. Not your situation, not immediately, but your perspective, and sometimes that's the first step to finally doing something different. Not out of pressure, not out of panic, but out of awareness. And that awareness might be the only thing that slowly starts to move you forward.